Hello, welcome to the Construction Record Podcast. I'm digital media editor Warren Frey, and with me today I have.
DCN and JOC editor Lindsay Cole.
And as per usual, we're going to go over what's happening in the West and the East right before I go off for about a week on vacation. So this is our last time for a week to get this, but next week we'll get it again, and maybe even in person. More later on that.
Yes, absolutely. And we wish you a very happy vacation, Warren. I am jealous,
Thank
but
you.
all the same, good. Hope you have a good time. From the East, we have a couple things on the go, some interesting project stories. I'm kind of carrying forth, I guess, the theme from last week, but essentially, there's some pretty cool announcements that have come forth. So this morning, right after Thanksgiving, Angela was right on site for an announcement from Maple Leaf Sports and Entertainment. Essentially, the Scotiabank Arena venue is going through an entire, quote, reimagination project. Okay. So, and it's an investment of more than $350 million. So as you can see, downtown Toronto with the, Rogers Center and the Scotiabank Arena, they are going forth with a number of renovations. So, it's kind of a cool, if you're a sports fan, that's pretty awesome to see these, both of these major venues in Toronto getting a kind of a rehab. So the Scotiabank Arena announcement, as I said, Angela was on a tour of that. So we're going to have a more comprehensive piece on it and what it entails and whatnot. But essentially, it's a multi-phase renovation project that's going to pretty much go through almost all of the areas of the venue. So concourses, suites, premium clubs, retail spaces, food and beverage stuff, as well as have some new technological offerings. So part of the announcement was showing some renovations that occurred in the summer. So it was kind of an unveiling of what happened with those renos, but it was also a preview of what's to come. So, stay tuned for that story because it's pretty cool. The renderings look pretty awesome from what I've seen. And I'm sure Angela will be speaking to a variety of sources about, including those involved in the construction, about what's to come. So kind of an exciting thing for downtown Toronto, with both of our major stadiums getting kind of a facelift. So yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing what they're doing with that. So, Angela's story will be pretty behind the scenes-ish. It's not every day we get invited to media tours either, so it's kind of a neat little perk. The second story out of the East that I wanted to highlight, again, it's by Angela. She recently attended, and we talked about it in our previous, news highlights here. She really got a lot out of the Canadian Institute for Steel Construction's conference that happened in Toronto. And essentially, this one is kind of a little bit more of I call it a journey behind the scenes for the Portland's bridges. Now, obviously, we've done a lot of stories on the Portlands. Grant Cameron did a great two-part series about the overall project and about what it entails. But this is actually specific to the bridges that were shipped over, how they were shipped over, how they were installed, because each one of them was unique. And apparently there were 4 of them. So obviously that's no small, feat to get these things in place and up and running. So it's an interesting story about what went into that. And I like to say it's kind of a tale about how they ventured all the way from Nova Scotia to the city. So it's pretty cool. Boy, I'm really highlighting Angela's stuff. Our last thing today is also by Angela out of the East. She'll be pleased to hear that she's the highlight of the Eastern newscast. But tomorrow is International Day of the Girl, which is a day that's dedicated to, celebrating the voices of women, empowering girls, championing their rights. So as a result of that, Skills Ontario, not Skilled Trades Ontario, Skills Ontario held a virtual event, in recognition of Day of the Girl. As part of that, we were able to get some perspective from an apprentice carpenter who's wanted to be an apprentice since she was 5 years old. So, yeah, it's pretty cool. She highlights why she got into it, what inspired her, why she thinks other, young girls should be exposed to it early. you know, obviously there's still challenges in the industry, but it's a great story about why the trades are a good opportunity for women. You know, even though she was told maybe she should, even because she was a straight A student, so they essentially said to her, "Hey, well, don't quote sell yourself short by being in the
Mhm.
trades. Why don't you become
Oh.
like an architect or an engineer?" So there was still quite you know, a negative connotation to it, which isn't
Mhm.
fair. And she just said, you know, no, I want to be on site, and I'm right where I'm supposed to be. So yeah, it's a great story about a woman who's pursuing her lifelong dream. So it's pretty cool.
And I actually have breaking news as of us recording this right now, which is on Tuesday at 10 or so in the morning Pacific time. The RCMP has announced they're going to investigate in a criminal investigation Ontario government's plan to open Greenbelt land for development. Now, obviously, right now, which is not Wednesday, we don't know anything beyond that. But rest assured, as Lindsay will tell you, we are going to be on this like, well, like something that's on things.
Yes, yes, we certainly will be on it. Um, yeah, we're literally seeing it come across our desk as we speak, as Warren
Mhm.
alluded to. It's just another, oh, well, another very controversial headline.
Yes.
Um, in what's becoming one heck of a saga in Ontario for our current government. So, as Warren said, we'll certainly be on it further. But this is, you know, obviously an extremely important development in the Greenbelt saga. So, stay
Mhm.
tuned. Now, moving out west. Now that I have been interrupted so rudely
By
by Warren. No,
news,
just
yes,
kidding.
and
Just
news.
kidding. Um, but on the Western Front. So we have a couple stories that are interesting with regards to a steel story. Again, kind of going along the steel route. This one's not out of the conference though, but one of our freelancer writers wrote a story about how two BC companies and a UBC researcher are trying to find a way to reduce steel corrosion, which has been coined the bane of steel buildings' existence, which I'm sure, you know, obviously some builders out there can probably relate to.
Mhm.
Um, what I thought was interesting about this story, and I think it's worth a read, is that they're taking a look at magnesium, of all things, as a way to potentially counteract or act as the sacrificial anode, for
Oh,
example. You know, I'm using some scientific terms which are not
very,
usually part
very
of my
much so. Yes.
vocabulary. But it essentially sacrifices itself to extend the life of the steel. So I guess it attracts the corrosive particles. So through a whole rigmarole, and
Mhm.
obviously you can read the story to get some more details about what exactly it entails. But you know, it's something that these companies and this researcher are looking into as a way to extend the life of steel. So pretty cool little development coming out of BC there, and worth exploring. The other aspect is more on the political front for BC, and I think, you know, and well, globally, really. Um, Basically, in Ottawa and in British Columbia, we have stakeholders and government officials saying that they are welcoming a ruling from the North American Free Trade Agreement, saying that elements of the United States calculation on softwood lumber duties are inconsistent with that country's
Mm.
own law. Yeah, no, you can attest to this, Warren. Softwood lumber duty dumping, all of that stuff has been
Yeah.
widely discussed out
Endlessly discussed.
endlessly
Yes.
out west. So this is welcome news because basically the NAFTA dispute panel agreed with the challenge from our government, saying that America's they're calling it a America's so-called dumping determination,
Mhm.
and
Okay.
it's not. It could be unwarranted. So you know, it's encouraging news for our side of the fence. You know, where it goes from here, we'll see, but it could mean, you know, that there could be some changes afoot with regards to softwood lumber duties, etc. You know, and we'll go from there. But I thought I would be remiss not to mention it because it is um, an interesting development that does widely impact construction. So that's where we sit on the western side of things, and that's about all I have out of the newsroom today, because now I have to go look up some greenbelt stuff.
Yes, you do, and so do I. And so, going with the American theme, up next we have Michael Guckes, our senior economist for ConstructConnect. He and I talk about, given how to put this gently, the U.S. Congress is currently in chaos. We want to talk about, not in a partisan manner or to take any sides or anything, but we want to talk about how, when the government's not working, how does that affect construction and the wider economy in the U.S. And so we kind of discuss how tied together the industry and government are, no matter who's in charge, and where you go from there. So that interview is up next. Normally we do this as Alex, but Alex is on vacation. I believe he's in Paris right now, which is very lucky for him. We're not anywhere near as interesting, but we are going to talk about something very interesting, which is the project stress metrics and other things besides. So why don't you start with that, Michael? You've actually you've been doing a lot in this field.
Right. So, I just want to take 2 seconds and I think just describe for the audience what it is, just in case anyone on the podcast, anyone listening to the podcast hasn't already heard this. But the project stress index is really, there's 3 components to it. We are measuring the number of projects that we are tracking. And we, of course, at ConstructConnect, we're tracking as much as we can in Canada and North America, but we're looking at the number of projects over the last 30 days all the time, and we're tracking the number of projects that either experience a delayed bid date, that experience being put on hold, or that worst of all, experience being abandoned. And so what we're doing is we every week we update this metric, but it's a 30-day look back at the count of all of those projects, and there's a seasonality to it. So in the history of data we have, which goes back to mid 2019. We have to seasonally adjust the data, and then I indexed it. So what we have now is, when you look at that report right now, for example, it reads 118.5 in the latest release. Well, what that means is that project stress is 18.5% greater today than it was during the average week of 2021. So it makes it very easy, right? The number is always telling you basically the percent change between what you're experiencing right now versus our baseline, which is just the average of 2021. And the only reason we picked 2021 is because 2020 was obviously an exceptional year. We saw huge spikes in stress. So we don't want to use 2020. 2022, we could have used, that was sort of the second best one, but there was also all the interest rate events going on, right? And as those interest rates increased, that created some stress and some unique challenges, I think, for the industry. And I didn't want to use 2022 as our baseline. So 2021 ended up being it. It was probably the least exceptional year. And hopefully, as we move forward, that 2021 baseline will continue to be a good year for us to reference. But we could always change that, I suppose, one day. Anyways, that is the quick background. We're looking at 3 different metrics, and we basically take the equal weight average of what's happening within each of those areas. So what that means is that even though abandoned projects only make up 5% of all the projects we see by count, they're the most severe form of stress. To see a project simply be abandoned is the worst thing that we can have happen, right? So I wanted to make sure that they didn't just represent 5% of the index. So that's where the equal weighting came in. So it gives the more stressful forms of project stress greater weight. Anyways, moving on from there, like I said, the latest reading was 118.5. That is a 5-month high. Earlier in the year, we saw a surge in abandoned projects at the beginning of the calendar year. It was the fastest first quarter surge that we've seen in the history of the index. Again, it's only 4 or so years old, so there's not a terribly long amount of history, but it was very unprecedented compared to all the other years. Even after seasonal adjustments and whatnot, this big surge in abandoned projects we saw in 2023 in the first quarter was concerning. It slowed down, and by June I thought, hey, what? Maybe because of interest rates, some firms looked at these projects and said, look, the ROI is no longer there under the new interest rate environment. So they gave up that big block of projects early on. By mid-June, things looked pretty normal. I thought, this is great. We're going to get back to sort of the status quo, and things will continue on as we would all hope them to. And yet, of course, that wasn't the case. We have seen in the last, say, 6 to 8 weeks or so, this kind of strong rebound in a new wave of both delayed projects, but also abandoned projects. So that is something that we continue to watch. Now, having said that, the third quarter of every construction year also happens to be when we usually see a peak in the levels of projects that experience some kind of stress. One of those 3 measures I pointed out. The seasonal adjustment factor that we are using to help level set everything does account for some of that. But even after that accounting for the fact that the third quarter is typically the worst quarter throughout the calendar year, we're still seeing this quick surge coming back in project stress levels. So it's something that we really want to keep our eyes focused on. I think for the industry, I know a lot of business leaders, understand that while everybody is providing starts forecasts, whether it's us or somebody else, starts only represents sort of the pre-construction potential for the industry, right? And not every start becomes an actual shovel in the ground project. Not everything on a blueprint becomes something that construction firm will be able to profit from. And so in that transition from paper to dirt, I hope this project stress index helps firms to understand what that transition looks like. And so it's just one of those interesting things that we like to keep the readers informed about because, starts forecasts can be great, but economic conditions can change such that, projects don't make it, out of the gate. So that's where we are right now.
And speaking of where we are right now, and I'd like to preface this by saying we don't want to talk about any of the political aspects and certainly not the partisan aspects of this, but we do have to talk about what's happening with Congress because that has economic knock-on effects, not least of which could be a shutdown 40 days from now and almost was a few days ago, right? So let's go into what the economic effects of that and just sort of the ongoing battle is.
Right. I think the way that we could talk about it in sort of non-politicized terms is simply, the role of government in the construction industry, right? It's huge. I think it has increased its importance since 2020 as well. We need to think about how the IIJA, the Inflation Reduction Act, right? A lot of these bills, they don't mention how much public spending is in them, but it's incredible, right? And then in addition to that, we're seeing a lot of these public-private partnerships as well, right? Triple P projects. That's what we used to call them when I worked in state government, where in some way, shape, or form, public money is helping support really what is a private endeavor. Whether it is, helping support an EV plant, a semiconductor plant, so much of what we're hearing now as well in that PPP realm is things of national defense importance, right? Things that will help the country to make sure that we have what we need in the event that something really bad might happen in the future, and we can't rely on overseas companies to provide that. And so we're building that infrastructure today, right? So that's fine and all. I mean, I think there will always be a place in my heart for global trade. That's just how I was educated back in the 90s, right? Global trade allows for the best of every country to produce what they're best at, and then we trade, and everyone is better off in the end. I still firmly believe that, but I get the idea that the world's a little more complicated than that. But all that being said, right? You're onto a good point. The smoothness of how the government functions is important to the success of these projects, right? Private sector firms, anybody who's into operations, right, knows that if you can level set your production, if you can make sure that you have all the people when you need them, all the materials when you need them, where you need them, things will move the most smoothly. And certainly what we're seeing today in government is not going to help any of that, right? And so that is the challenge. What does this do for the public infrastructure work? What does this do to the PPP projects? The other challenge too is that we've gone essentially every year since the late 70s running budget deficits. And the last time we had interest rates this high, The public debt to GDP was 35%. Today we're running closer, to 100%. And so it's this combination of the existing debt level combined with the interest rate that puts us in a really unique territory. People have been complaining for decades, right, that the government has been taking on too much debt. The debt clock in New York City has been around for as long as I can remember, which tells you just how long the issue has been one of contentiousness.
And that spans Republican and Democratic governments.
Absolutely,
it's kind of bipartisan in a way.
Absolutely. It's almost irrelevant which side of the aisle you're on. Everybody wants to spend more money than they have, for whatever reasons make sense to them. If we could all spend more money than we have, we would probably do it too.
Yeah, fair enough.
It's just human nature. But right, so that's the challenge really for the industry. The concern is this, and I've been talking a lot about this everywhere I go. Government spending is largely, first of all, there's two buckets when it comes to government spending. There's non-discretionary things that the government must do, right? The government must commit to its obligations to, pay for Social Security, to pay for Medicare, Medicaid. It's by law, it must pay those costs. There's no getting around it. That leaves a much smaller bucket of money, about a third to a quarter of all tax income is therefore left over for discretionary spending. So the government has some say year to year on what it's going to spend that money on. And that falls into three major buckets. And one of those buckets really concerns us because the first bucket really is defense. The second bucket is the interest on the government debt. And the third one is public spending on things like construction, right? So that's, and education is the other big one, right? So when you really think about it, it's defense spending, education, and construction spending for public infrastructure. Those are some of the big pots.
There's probably some crossover between defense and construction as well, I would think, with building bases and building bridges,
sure.
Like Army Corps of Engineers, stuff like that. Yeah.
Sure, but the vast majority is going to be things like highways. Right. That's always been a big one for example, right? But that's the challenge is that right now we've gotten to the point where the government last year, for example, they spent, I think it was $1.7 trillion on discretionary spending, right? Of that, the government only self-funded 300 million of that. So something like 80% of all of our discretionary spending, again, that includes construction spending, that was only possible because of deficit spending, because we had to borrow money somewhere to make those projects happen. And the concern is really, with the way that things are going, higher interest rates, the size of the debt, right? The amount of interest that we're paying on that debt is going to quickly increase. And we've already seen those numbers start to really bite. And the challenge is that, okay, well, at some point, all of your discretionary spending goes away. Increased Medicare cost, Social Security cost, increased payments on debt interest expense. There's just nothing left without 100% or, of everything that we want to discretionarily buy having to be funded by debt. Well, now you become, essentially you're locked into you have to borrow in order to just survive. And that becomes the terrifying part because that's when the music stops. When you have to borrow in order to just function at all, you are in a sort of like in a path of no return, right? And that's the concern, right? And there's ways that is affecting us even today. If somebody, obviously, a lot of people will want to say, Guckes, you're talking so far down the road. People have been screaming about this for decades. Yet we're all still here and the world hasn't collapsed, and they get that. And I get that too. But the thing is that, we're already starting to see these impacts. Your mortgage rate is at 7.5%, 8% now for some areas in the United States, at least. And if you look at why that is, right, well, it's because of what is happening in the Treasury market, right? You're safe borrowing. The government debt is supposed to be safe, right? It's always that it's always been thought of that the government's going to pay its debts. And so the risk-free rate of borrowing, as they call it in the finance world, is whatever your treasury bond rate is. Well, right now that's 4.5% and rising. Well, what that means is that for everybody else who's considered more risky, which is everyone, no one is less risky than the government, except for I think Microsoft and maybe one or two other Fortune 100 firms. But they're obviously the exception. But the point is that everyone's cost of borrowing continues to go up in part because of what is happening in government. So sort of the more difficult that the government's financial position becomes, the higher their interest rates are going to be, because the bond market is full of people who are out there to make money for themselves. They're not out there to be altruistic and to help the government. They're out there to advance themselves. When they realize sort of the base level of riskiness of buying government debt, especially longer term stuff, possibly, that raises that interest rate on the bond side and the public sector. Then you get into the private sector where everything is whatever the public sector rate is plus some premium for the additional risk. And this is where the problem becomes, because if the government becomes inherently more risky at this point moving forward, right? Everybody above them, everyone in the private sector is going to become penalized in the interest rate that they receive. And now you're into a situation where, one day the economy won't be so hot. The Federal Reserve will want to do things to lower interest rates, and yet the system's going to break because because this rule about riskiness doesn't change. It's something equivalent to gravity in the financial markets. You and I will never be able to borrow on a home at a lower interest rate than what the government gets when they sell debt. And so that is the challenge. And we're already seeing this now. This has been in the data for the last year or so. As government debt goes up, everyone is paying the penalty for that transgression that has been decades in the making. It just has finally started to come home to roost, I think. So that is the long and short of my concerns, and I think it should be our audience's concerns with government debt. The idea that interest rates were going to get back down to where they were, in the 20 teens, right? The 2015s through 2019, right? Where debt is 2, 3, 4%. We're not going back to that in the foreseeable future. And so anyone who is hoping for that, I think that ship has sailed. The challenge then becomes that next level of thinking is, well, shoot, people in the CRE space who already own, assets, office buildings, apartment buildings, whatever they should be, those assets, if they're rolling that debt over in the coming years, and there's $1 trillion due in 2024, and there's another $1 trillion of it due in 2025, now you have to refinance that at much higher rates, rates much closer to what they are today, not what they were 2-3 years ago. And the question becomes one of, how does that work? There was a bit of research done by some reporters at the Wall Street Journal last month. They were looking at some CRE data and trying to figure out, well, what is the market price for a lot of office and apartment buildings and other retail facilities right now. Sometimes it's hard to figure out, what is the going price for these things. And some of their research basically said, look, if you bought or built an apartment building or an office building 2 or 3 years ago, say pre-COVID, for $100 million, a lot of those buildings nowadays, their market price is somewhere between 50 and 65 million. So basically, it's a little better than half the price of what it was 2 years ago. Well, now imagine this: you have $100 million loan for that building that you built in 2019 or thereabouts. That loan comes due next year. It's going to be at double the interest rate, and yet so your interest payment, your monthly mortgage payment on that will go way up. But the question is, can you afford it, right? Can the owner developer still make the financing work when their interest rate, when their mortgage cost goes way up, and yet their tenant revenues aren't moving, anything close to being double, of course.
Mhm.
You know, if they could just hold steady in with these kinds of high vacancy rates that we're already seeing, especially in the office space, right? That all is the challenge, right? And so that begs the question, you know, what kind of volatility will we see moving forward? And when we look at things like starts data, when we look at starts for apartments,
Mhm.
when we look at some other construction starts data, it is very much you know, the projections are very much vertical dependent. And we've been saying that for a long time now. You know, warehouse, industrial, and manufacturing construction is exceeding in areas where, say, for example, office space has just collapsed, right? And
Mhm.
it's very hard to sometimes look at the numbers in some of these more affected verticals. But you know, like we say, where you play does really matter now. This idea that, you know, a rising tide or a falling tide sinks or raises all ships, you know, that is not the case in construction. Which verticals you play in matter significantly. And
Mhm.
again, that's why one of the other messages that we're constantly pushing out to our customers and the audience is this idea of diversification. It is so important to be diversified by vertical, and if you can, by geography as well. But if you're, if you're a firm that works within a given MSA or a given state, and you can't just pick up and move to a different geography. But if you can, though, attempt to get business along different verticals, and even consider, not just verticals like medical versus manufacturing versus office, but also consider the public-private part.
Mhm.
Historically speaking, it's always been probably helpful, especially based on what we see in the project stress index data. You want to make sure that you have some mix of private and public. You don't want it to be all private. You don't want it to be all public. Your best bet is to have some mix of both. And then that way, whatever happens in the market, hopefully your chips are spread, your bets are spread out enough that you will have sufficient work to kind of maintain minimal operations in a worst case scenario.
And finally, we have in our show notes here that you put together about how starts are kind of indicating that we mentioned offices, we mentioned COVID, offices, there's a whole trend, or at least it's a talking point about changing offices into residential or adapting them to other uses.
Yeah.
And you said the starts indicate that might not be as easy as it sounds, although there's plenty of other reasons they may not be as easy either.
Right. Yeah. The long and short of that story is that, there's been talk in recent years, right, about there was such a low vacancy rate, an extremely low vacancy rate among apartments for a long time. And then with the sort of surge in office vacancies, there's been a lot of discussion around, well, can we convert offices to apartments? And from the anecdotal evidence I have, and from what some of the smart people in that space have said, that gets really hard because the plumbing isn't right, the HVAC isn't right, you don't get the right airflow. Lighting is a problem. Nobody wants to live in the center of an office building where there's no natural light, things of that nature. And so to convert offices to apartments is an expensive proposition.
Mhm.
But I know that there are plenty of people where, they think that the location might allow for it. The dynamics of that particular regional or local market might allow it. And I get that. But what we're seeing too is an extra complication now to that story, because what we're seeing is this really strong fall off in multifamily data. So, one of the things that we're looking at, and I'm looking at our 6-month moving average of apartment or multi-unit, sorry, I should say multi-unit residential data, but the number of starts has just collapsed. We were at something like 550,000 units being started at the beginning of the year, and we're down to, on a 6-month moving average, we're at about 330,000. So that's a big collapse there, a big decline. And then when you look at the number of completes, the trajectory is very much the same. We've seen in the last roughly 6 to 8 months a big slowdown there. And at the same time, we've seen an increase in rental vacancy rates. So for the first time since roughly 2010, right, we're seeing rental vacancy rates actually increase after spending, over 10 years on the decline, again, fueling all of that apartment construction energy in the past years. So this is the problem, is it really begs the question, have we gotten to the point where supply and demand are now balanced? Do we need to be concerned that with the huge surge of apartment starts that we saw between 2020 and 2022, was that actually too much supply being added? So it's a question of, are we going to have an oversupply problem because of just how much work has been in the pipeline the last 2.5 years that is at some level of construction not quite completed? Right. So you have that again. So just to make sure that I tie it all together, right? If we have a balanced market and now you're trying to bring in additional people late to the game who want to convert offices to apartments at a very high cost premium, that might not be a good move in your typical market. And so these are the kinds of dynamics that we're continually evaluating and monitoring to make sure that we help our customers understand what is the world going to look like 2, 3, 4, 5 years down the road, so that they're not investing in projects that may or may not have the kind of return that they're projecting.
And finally, you have a thing called the Construction Economics Brief. I hope I got the title right. It's a video you do every month. And maybe if you could plug that as we say goodbye.
Absolutely. So much of our work historically has been written format. A lot of it, if you're familiar with our monthly and quarterly reports, they're many pages long, dozens of charts and graphs. And we're trying to do something a little different. We're trying to be more sensitive to how much time people have to spend consuming really, I think, the most important construction economic information. So what we're doing with this Construction Economics Brief is trying to boil down the 3 most important things that we see on our radar each month. And we're putting that into a 2 to 3 minute video. And then we put that up on our ConstructConnect properties along as well as on social media.
Cool. So, all right. Yeah. Great. And we'll put a link to that in the show notes for sure. Thanks again for joining us, Michael.
Always my pleasure.
And that's it for this episode of the Construction Record Podcast. You can hear us on Spotify, Apple Music, and Amazon Music, as well as on our daily commercial news and Journal of Commerce websites. Thanks for listening.